Hello, I'm Armaan, and this is Unending History. And today we're going to be talking about the Taliban, its history, structure, and possibly, and a little bit about its future in Afghanistan. And today we're joined by Max,
Hello?
Noah,
Hello.
and Owen.
Hello.
All right, so the Taliban is a name that's known to pretty much everyone throughout the world at this point. They've made their name. Um, they're quite well known, and you would think they would need little introduction, but they're also an organization that is notoriously secretive, um, and one that has been influenced by a confusing array of ideologies and religious and ethnic affiliations. And I just wanted to start out today's episode by going into some of that. Um, so the Taliban is really a product of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, um, above all, and the influence of both South Asian and Saudi religious movements on refugee camps in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, which is on the, of course, Afghan border. Um, so after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, a lot of people, a lot of young Afghan men, fled into Pakistan and went to madrasas, which are religious schools, Islamic religious schools, in Pakistan. And at the time, there was an explosion of madrasa founding and construction, um, especially in this region, in along the Afghan border. And a lot of the mullahs who were teaching at these madrasas were not very experienced, um, and often gave interpretations of Sharia that were very much influenced by Afghan cultural standards, by Pashtunwali, right? By Afghan social um, codes and Afghan morality, as opposed to Islam. And furthermore, a lot of these madrasas were funded by Saudi Wahhabis who follow a very strict form of Islam that's not uh, familiar to most Afghans. So all of this resulted in an ideology that was much more fundamentalist and much stricter than anything that was familiar to Afghans normally, and one that would not really be possible to make within Afghanistan. Um, and when the Taliban returned to Afghanistan, it was at a time when all of the other warlords had been largely discredited, with a few small exceptions, and there was so much chaos that it was very easy for them to take power. And so, in the words of Barfield, one of our sources today, um, he said this strategy of getting rid of foreign occupiers by making the country ungovernable now came back to haunt the Afghans themselves. So they were unable to form any kind of consensus or unified government, and that is the kind of hellish situation that the Taliban could exploit. Um, it was less from being able to appeal to any popular support, and more just from the fact that it was so chaotic. Um, and when the Taliban um, took over, uh, they didn't become any more popular. Their policies were, as I said, foreign to what most Afghans um, were used to, or rather, their interpretation of Islam was completely different than what native Afghans would be used to. And when the U.S. and coalition forces and the Northern Alliance took back Afghanistan, Afghans were by and large happy to see the Taliban go. Uh, Naturally, as we all know, the Taliban would come back uh, from a mixture of factors. And one of the things that U.S. policymakers and observers have lamented is the fact that there was never any serious effort to include the Taliban in peace talks uh, during the invasion. At the Bonn Agreement, which is the agreement where key Afghan leaders were invited to make a new government, there was no Taliban representation. There's no attempt to make the Taliban demobilize, etc. So my first question for the episode, for you guys, is should the West, so should NATO forces, the United States, etc., have made an effort to reconcile with the Taliban, or is the real problem that we let too many get away? Too many of the leadership. So to rephrase that, is it a matter of a failed and incomplete counterinsurgency program that the Taliban stuck around, or was the real problem that we didn't make an effort, we being the United States, didn't make an effort to include them in peace talks?
I would lean firmly on the side of that we didn't make enough, or the US and its allies didn't make enough of an effort to include the Taliban in peace talks. So just to be clear, the Taliban were eventually involved in peace talks, but at a much later date, as part of a broader policy change that came under the Obama administration. By which point, I think you can argue it was sort of too late, really, and that they had definitely taken on this more distinctly anti the US-backed government position. Perhaps earlier on, it could have been possible, as in sort of immediately, sort of 2001, 2003 kind of period. It might have been possible to involve them in those talks, to try and bring them into the government in a similar manner to how many other warlords were brought into the Afghan government. Arguably, really, the Taliban and Al Qaeda were the only people excluded from that process. Of course, to some extent, that goes against the declared, at least, American intention, which was to create a more liberal form of government in Afghanistan, which arguably isn't really compatible with the Taliban. And to the difficulty of probably selling that back in the US, given that the Taliban had been established in the minds of most Americans as this affiliate of Al Qaeda.
I think that if I had to choose one, I would agree, Owen. But I actually think that the military element of the U.S. Invasion, of the U.S.'s solution, as it were, to the Taliban problem, was also botched. The initial phases of the invasion were a resounding success by and large, but the fact that the U.S. was not willing to put more troops on the ground, and they wanted to keep it this clean air power based operation, it let practically the entire Taliban leadership get away, and of course Osama bin Laden. Um, I mean Tora Bora, which I think probably most people are familiar with, right?
Yeah,
Um, was uh, truly, I mean, one of the most critical losses of that war, just because the U.S. was not willing to put down its own troops to catch fleeing Al Qaeda and Taliban forces, and they relied too much on the Northern Alliance. I think that it's conceivable that if they had made a full serious effort that was not so hands off, they could have nipped it in the bud from the beginning very easily. I mean, that's another possibility.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is I think at the beginning of this series, I would have just said, oh, yeah, no, we made a huge mistake and we should have worked to integrate the Taliban into the government, so on and so forth. And I, I don't hold that position as strongly. I'm not necessarily against that position, but I'm pretty suspect of to what extent it would have worked anyway. As in, do I really believe that even if the Taliban had been worked into the government, that they would have changed?
Or that the Pakistanis or that ISI
Right,
would not
exactly.
kept
Like the
funding
people
them.
funding them would still be the same people funding them, you know?
Yeah.
I
And they wouldn't have stopped interacting with
right, it would
Al-Qaeda.
have given them an opportunity to rebuild even more easily than they did, and they rebuilt pretty easily. I mean, you know, easy's relative here, but um, it, it between 2002 and 2004, they were pretty dead. Like as an organization, they weren't finished. They still had their leadership, and so they could rebuild, and they still had resources, but they were not a functioning fighting force. And I kind of get why the U.S. stopped worrying about him for a while. Um, but I also agree, like, if the U.S. had done a more thorough job investing, particularly in the South and, you know, in and around Kandahar, maybe they wouldn't have been able to come back so easily, right? But I guess my more concise way of putting it might be like, I think the U.S. led efforts, both diplomatically and militarily, fell really short in those first few years. Um,
Yeah, I think the US was so focused on Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and the narratives that people in the Bush administration had spun for themselves about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction that didn't always, of course, match reality. They just were not paying attention to the Taliban enough, and they were just concerned about getting in, um, shooting up as many Al Qaeda members as they could, and trying to kill Osama bin Laden, and then leaving for Iraq because
right. I
so
think that's
much
a
of the
big
U.S.
element here, that Iraq
Yeah.
really detracted from efforts in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they didn't have to worry about Iraq, they would have had to at least pretend they were taking it seriously more, if not fully take it seriously. And I think that it was a couple of elements. One, America's uh, reluctance to get deeply involved with something that they don't really care about, because they're in Afghanistan to kill Osama bin Laden and, you know, take care of Al Qaeda. They don't care about the Taliban. That's one element. And two, uh, mimicking what the Soviets did, because we liked, a lot of us, people who watched the news up until the Taliban takeover. There were so many jokes flying around about, oh, the U.S. is just doing what the Soviets did, and people would compare photos of Soviet helicopters leaving and American helicopters leaving, and so on. Uh, America, of course, the Bush administration went in with a Soviet intervention in mind, and they said, okay, we're not going to get deeply involved like the Soviets did. We're going to just make a few little surgical strikes here and not invest everything. But they're doing it out of this, in my opinion, a general sense of both fear and indifference, fear of getting bogged down, and indifference to actually dealing with making Afghanistan a state.
Yeah, right.
And
And toppling a
because that,
government is hardly
yeah,
a surgical strike.
yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, I don't know what would have been possible as in if they could have tried to more actively fight Al Qaeda in Afghanistan without fighting the Taliban. I don't know. But
Yeah.
um
But in any case, so the main point here was, I think, more about if we should have we being like coalition forces should have engaged more directly with the Taliban. And I don't know. I'm not totally against the integration into government angle, but I also think that it wouldn't have taken much to just wipe them out. Um, and of course, it's the hypothetically safer option. Um,
yeah, and yeah, again, like being the age that we are, I was sort of surprised how wiped out they had been.
yeah,
Because because by the time like I really can remember like following events going on in Afghanistan, they had already come back.
yeah,
Um, and so I hadn't realized how collapsed uh, the Taliban had gotten.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that leads us to our next point, which is if they really were, if since they really were so beaten down and demolished, how were they able to bounce back to a significant insurgency in just a few years? Um, did you guys
And I
find any
think
key factors?
I think there's always that aspect of like our key allies in the region continued to fund them.
That's pretty hard to ignore.
Yeah,
Like,
Pakistan.
well, it's pretty easy to ignore for us.
Right.
You know, I think the fact that Pakistan continued to fund the Taliban throughout the occupation like really had a lot to do with them coming back and their ability to come back, really.
Yeah, and they would very angrily and vociferously deny and shout down any Afghan or American allegations that they were doing it, as with the hand behind their back, they're continuing to give guns to the Taliban. It was really just
And
two-faced.
importantly, helping to shelter members of their leadership.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
As well as,
Training. There were
to
training camps in Pakistan for the
right.
Taliban, etc.
yeah,
To Pakistan's credit as a country, it also took in a lot of refugees. But unfortunately, within those refugees, were in
yeah.
was Taliban as well. But they
It's not as if
Pakistan
they,
has been taking Afghan refugees for decades now.
yeah, but it's not as if they could not take
Right,
them.
sure.
The
But
Pakistan-Afghan border is it's the most porous border in the world. I can say confidently. Um, yeah, I'm sure they did a lot of good like humanitarian work, but also, like you're saying, they're a lot of those refugees are fighters. They're not just displaced families. And so the Pakistani element, the ISI element, and the government element is one part of it, but also a big part of it is clearly the madrasas,
yeah.
and especially as I briefly mentioned, the Deobandi madrasas. Um, I don't know if you guys read up on Deobandism in the readings.
Just a little bit on the side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess what the Taliban was following was a very um, kind of stretched form of Deobandism that had been run through a layer of Pashtunwali and another layer of Salafism to make this very cursed kind of amalgam of doctrines. And so from Deobandism, they took a lot of elements that were very anti-tribal,
Hmm.
because Deobandi um, clerics had for a long time agitated against tribal hierarchy, and they also picked up a lot of restrictive gender views, but they took it and ratcheted it up even further under the influence of Salafism. But I think these madrasas were a big part of what let the Taliban bounce back, because whenever Mullah Omar was low on manpower, for example, after being defeated at Mazar in 1997, he would just write a letter to Samuel Haq, the leader of this madrasa that he was in contact with, and the madrasa would send the entire student body to fight for the Taliban. And no other faction had that kind of resource in the Civil War. I think that's pretty hard to ignore. Just the sheer amount of manpower that they had at their disposal.
Yeah, because they weren't. One of the unique things about the Taliban, of all the fighting forces in Afghanistan, is that they're not local, in a sense. I mean, they're not like purely locally based. They are to some extent, Pashtun oriented. Like, well, they're certainly Pashtun oriented, so they have, recruitment limits to some extent there. But because they're not basically a local militia owned by some governor/warlord, they have a pretty steady manpool and manpower pool, I guess. And that, and also they get, outside funding, although a lot of the militias were also getting outside funding from the US government, so yeah.
Yeah. And so we've talked about some of these things, like what the Taliban had on its side, but did you guys pick out any key elements with the other side of the picture of places where the West or coalition forces failed to crack down or stop the Taliban expansion that really let the Taliban spring back?
I'd say a big element would have been how corrupt the Afghan government was, especially since even back in like the days of the civil war in the 90s, the Taliban presented themselves as a force, sort of anti-corruption sort of movement to an extent, and it was pretty easy to just keep hammering that point. The sort of and again, sort of the anti-tribal aspect to it, the sort of the tolerance of a lot of tribal warlords under Hamid Karzai's government as well, contributing to it, kind of gave, I would have said, the Taliban a lot of ammunition to recruit sort of people and sort of justify basically their opposition to the government.
Yeah, I think that was a big boon for the Taliban, that everyone else was so obviously corrupt, and they were the only ones who could claim to be doing what they said they would do, more or less. I think the one exception to that, one key exception, is their practice of ethnic cleansing and violence. That's of something that's, of course, not very Islamic, but otherwise they fit a script of jihad. Jihad being the self-improvement or improvement of the community under the precepts of Islam, right? So in the past, jihads were launched against corrupt rulers, which in Islam you are typically encouraged or allowed to overthrow if they're not being moral. So it fit that script very well. I think you're right.
There's one element I'd like to bring up as well, which is that the Afghan government, or the US, or both, also failed to make the Afghan government seem like much more than a puppet of the US.
Yeah.
Like the government itself, not besides just corruption, I think it always kind of looked like a Western propped up government. And that's exactly what the kinds of things the Taliban were sort of their origin comes from against, right? Like comes from fighting against, right? Like it's
Yeah.
perfect optics or whatever for
Yeah.
Taliban fighters is like, oh, yeah, the government's corrupt. And of course they're going to be corrupt because they're propped up by, decadent, corrupt Western, liberals. And all of this stuff goes hand in hand. And if you're, and that's sort of perfect messaging. The one thing that's interesting that I maybe push a little bit against from what Owen said was I don't think that the Taliban's anti-tribal status necessarily helps them. But what's so curious to me, a few episodes ago we were talking about like jirgas and local Pashtun customs and Pashtunwali, and what's interesting to me is like the Taliban is so against certain elements of that tribal culture, but that doesn't seem to have hurt them all that much in the South, Like, in the end, the South is where most of their strength was. And I'm almost sort of wondering if the West overestimated the strength of those, or its ability to sort of harness some of those traditions to fight against the Taliban. Because the Taliban are not interested in like having jirgas, right? They focused on empowering the ulema, right? So, that's sort of just a curious element to me, is why they weren't more disliked locally for those reasons.
Yeah. If I had to hazard a guess, it would be simply that everyone else was too corrupt or disliked. Not that the Taliban was in any way appealing, or rather their failure to appeal to the tribal values of ordinary Pashtuns was outweighed by the fact that they were the only people who weren't corrupt, and that both for internal and external reasons. So there were the people fighting. So for internal reasons, the people fighting on the side of the Taliban were less mercenary in their motivations. Their loyalty, at least in the beginning of the war, was less likely to just be bought. And from external factors, and this is my opinion, this is not me saying like a hard fact. For external factors, I think people were refreshed to see someone who would keep law and order and wouldn't steal their children for sex trafficking, for example. Do you have any other remarks on this before we move on? So this next question is probably one of the more difficult that we'll talk about today, because it has a lot of complex factors at play. But I wanted to ask you all how much the Taliban can claim to be an Islamic movement, or in what way is the Taliban an Islamic movement? And more to the point, will its Pashtun or Durrani Pashtun favoritism undermine its ability to work with other ethnic groups in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan now that they're in power? Because while the Taliban has claimed to be an Islamic movement, we've had horrible incidents such as in 1997 with a massacre of Hazaras, and violence against other ethnic and religious minorities throughout the Taliban's time in Afghanistan. Can we really claim that the Taliban's are primarily an Islamic movement, or is it just a charade for Pashtun elements to dominate the rest of the country more?
Can't it be both?
Could you elaborate on that a little more?
Like, I feel like it's Islamic insofar as any of the like extremist movements are that promote violence and tend to favor ethnic cleansing.
I mean, I guess the difficult thing for me is they really do seem to be trying to adhere to a form of Islam, primarily above all, as their guiding star, as it were. But it almost, I mean, it's hard to know with as organization as secretive as the Taliban, but it almost seems that they're too almost just intuitively or instinctively stuck in this Pashtun prejudice, or this prejudice against Hazaras, Tajiks, etc., rather than from any programmatic, secretive plan to exclude the other ethnic groups.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying here that the Taliban is not exactly the most centralized, organized political party. It's a movement of people, and it's a violent movement, or a movement willing to use violence. If I'm not sure there's that much of a distinction there, but that is, made up of a lot of young guys, and it's pretty hard to, toe a single line in a movement like that. There's going to be some who, there's already factions in the Taliban, right? Like, there were factions before they took leadership, and there's the fact that factionalism will probably get worse, unless there's sort of more, it's possible it could become more unified, but it doesn't seem to be becoming that much more unified. And so there's going to be more who keep towing, who do a better job of towing that sort of strictly Islamic line. And then there's going to be others who are not really worried about that. There's one other thing I'd like to say, which is that having talked with some folks from a couple different parts of Afghanistan, they do really seem, at least the ones who don't like the Taliban already, don't seem to like them. They don't like them for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that they bring up is that it's they feel like it's an explicitly Pashtun movement, right? So if they're Tajik or Turkmen or something, that scares them. They're worried about that, and there are people leaving Afghanistan in part for that reason.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something pretty important, which is the fact that the Taliban, it isn't even a party, it's a movement, it's a
Right.
loose movement. And in fact, Taliban officials have said multiple times that parties are, in their eyes, un-Islamic, right? Parties of any kind. And they're made up of groups of people with individual interests. It just so happens that those individuals are often Pashtun and have strong biases against other ethnic groups.
Right. Yeah. I made a joke to my friend the other day, which is to say, like, he was saying, so is the Taliban, like, in charge of the government? And I said, well, are Irish Catholics in charge of the government in the US?
Yeah.
Biden, is Biden's obviously, a Catholic and he's Irish. But nobody's of course these days accusing people of papism, but the Taliban are a little more directly in control there in Afghanistan. But it is like it's a religious movement, so there's
And
similarities.
of course, I think that it just so happened to be that most of the refugees who went to the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan were Durrani or Pashtun and not Hazara or Tajik. Um, I'm not entirely sure why, except well, there's one clear answer, which is that those Pashtun areas are on the border,
Right.
and the Hazaras are not on the border with
Yeah, I
Pakistan.
would think if the Hazara go anywhere, they'd rather go to Iran, but I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so I think that yeah, it's clearly complicated, but it's hard to deny that there are Pashtun. There's like serious Pashtun favoritism, even with some token appointments of other ethnic groups into the current emirate government. Uh, like they appointed a Hazara and a Tajik to major positions. It's hard to ignore. Um, but do you think that favoritism will cause the government in the emirate today to shoot itself in the foot going forward? Or is that something that you think they will be able to compromise with based on what people like Akhundzada have said so far? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think long term that they can compromise but continue to show favoritism to Pashtuns, largely because, for one, Pashtuns aren't a majority in Afghanistan. They are the largest group. They are a
They're
plurality,
plurality, but yeah.
Yeah,
but they're not
plurality.
the actual outright majority. Tajiks, Hazara, Uzbeks make up significant chunks of the rest of the population, and it's very regional as well. Um, and really, when you look at a lot of similar cases to Afghanistan, and even the history of Afghanistan itself, if it's not really possible to govern the country and exclude that such a large chunk of the population, especially in a country as already decentralized as Afghanistan. Ultimately, you're going to get some local power bases in amongst sort of the Tajik and Uzbek communities, which will probably end up being sort of a springboard for opposition to the Taliban again. I mean, there's still obviously some bits of like the resistance to the Taliban ongoing. Um, I could just see it being a repeat of the late 90s again, which was mostly non-Pashtuns rebelling against the Taliban.
Yeah, one of the ways that the Taliban immediately on their emergence broke with tradition in Afghanistan is by appointing uh, administrators who are not from the local area to regional uh, regional authorities. Um, so we've already seen the Taliban give some small token uh, appointments to ethnic minorities. Um, it's possible that over time they'll face more pressure. But it's hard for me to say if how much that will be. Um, so we've talked about some of the ethnic elements here. Um, but in terms of and we also talked a little bit about the tribal aspect earlier. Um, and on that topic, traditionally in Afghanistan, the tribe as a as a pillar of society has been more influential than the clergy, than the ulema in most Afghans' daily issues, in daily disputes, legal matters, etc. Um, and clearly, the Taliban has upset that and given the ulema, the clergy, and the clerics a lot more power. Um, even as we saw in the last Loya Jirga, giving clerics much more power than tribal authorities. So on that topic, do you think that will be an effective power base that is relying on the clerics going forward, or do you think they will have to work more to integrate the tribal authorities into their government to get things done? Because this is a big shift for Afghanistan, moving more to a clerical primacy.
I don't know if we can answer that. Because
Yeah.
it's
That's the biggest question.
it's hard to know. I mean, it kind of seems like that there's been a shift more and more towards the ulema since the Soviet invasion. Anyway, I mean, in part, like the Mujahideen movements generally kind of pushed more ulema factors, and the ulema gained authority just from helping organize resistance to the Soviet. And then the Taliban were in charge and certainly favored the ulema, and now the Taliban and the areas that the Taliban have been in charge of for a while now, they're certainly going to strengthen the ulema. So I don't know. What I do know is I think we got to wrap this up.
Yeah. Then that brings me to the last question, which is this. So the Taliban have ended up in power through a lot of factors, including the incompetence and lack of power of its enemies. But once the dust settles and the Afghans get used to the Taliban, do you think that they're going to be able to effectively build legitimacy with them, based on the tenets, the policies and practices we see them doing now? Or do you think that the way they are handling Afghanistan right now is unsustainable politically?
I think that's a great question for next episode.
Okay.
Well, credits.
That's going to be one of the subjects of our next episode. We're going to be talking more about the last year or so of Taliban rule in Afghanistan, what's been going on, what's happening now, and we can maybe talk about some hopes or fears for the future of Afghanistan. But yeah, I think that pretty much concludes what time we have here today.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in episode 6.
Before you go, we want to say thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check back soon for more. You can continue listening to us where you found this one. We'll welcome listener feedback, which you can send to us at our email at unendinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.